we've been really pleased with the considerable effort that all of our EPPs have made to develop proposals that are truly reflective of all of the work that we've done collaboratively together for the last several years. We were really impressed with your efforts, and I hope that the review process will also be something that you'll find to be helpful as well. We'll talk more about that as we go through the webinar today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Annie Insana, who will get us going.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is Annie Insana. I'm Director of Literacy for Educator Preparation and Induction. Thanks for joining us this morning. Just a few webinar logistics. We do have all of you on mute to avoid any sort of feedback from the webinar. If you could, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and mute your microphones for your audio. And we will also be engaging with the chat feature. So if you have any questions regarding the material that we are going over for the webinar today, please send a quick message either to Amy Wooten or to Tiffany Dellard via the chat feature. So let's go ahead and get started with our agenda today. The main things that we'll be covering, we want to talk a little bit about this round one review process, and really what that means is the point that you have started drafting your proposals upon submission by April 15th, and then this first iteration of the review is what we call round one. So I want to talk a little bit about those details that were involved in terms of the review process. We also want to cover the preparing for revisions, what resources you'll need, what you'll need to be thinking about in terms of preparing for making those revisions. And then we'll get into really the meat of drafting revisions and the particular things to pay attention to. And we'll actually go through question by that proposal and really target the particular criteria on the rubric that EPPs have found to have either approaching or below ratings on, and really how to support you in thinking about these particular criteria more deeply, and to really support you as you're going through drafting these revisions. We'll talk a bit about the logistics behind submitting revisions, and then our next steps, including our overall timeline for the rest of this proposal review process. So for round one review process, all proposals were reviewed by a minimum of 3 trained reviewers. These trained reviewers went through approximately a day and a half of training. The first half of that training session was a half-day webinar in which the reviewers were walked through all of the components of the proposal template as well as the literacy rubric criteria. The full in-person training day actually walked the reviewers through an example proposal, and reviewers were given the chance to think carefully through each one of those questions and be able to think about the narrative responses and attachments and be able to pull out evidence and provide a rating based on that evidence, and to write substantive feedback in order to support next steps or suggestions for improvement. And so this was a rigorous training process, and again, all 22 of our LEA and EPP reviewers went through this mandatory training. All reviewers were trained using department-developed scoring documents. We'll talk about 2 of these in particular, which are the literacy rubric criteria, which we then converted into an evidence and feedback tool that the reviewers used for each review, and the literacy rubric scoring notes guide for early elementary and special education programs. So we'll walk through those 2 particular tools. So this literacy rubric criteria was transformed into this tool that was used for reviewers. And the reviewers were instructed to read each proposal that they were received for the review in its entirety, to read through it briefly, and then to review each component of the comprehensive questions. And they were instructed to use this evidence and feedback tool that what you'll notice here on the screen is it's essentially the literacy rubric criteria with a space below for the reviewers to provide the evidence that they saw that support this criteria, either in the meet, approaching, or below ratings, and also provide the space for the reviewers to provide a rating for each question and feedback. The literacy rubric scoring notes is a document that you may not have seen yet. Once the evidence was collected, reviewers used the literacy rubric scoring notes as a guide to provide a rating for each question. Although we believe that all the criteria found in the literacy rubric is essential to demonstrate alignment to the EPP literacy standards and teaching literacy in Tennessee, this document was provided to reviewers to support their decision-making when providing a rating for each question response. We think it's really important that you review this document, and I'll show you exactly where this is located within your Dropbox and review resources, as it can provide additional support for meeting expectations for each question. So scoring notes, this is an example of how the scoring notes were formatted, particular for question 1. And so what we did was we took the literacy rubric criteria for this particular question. We broke it into primary and secondary criterions. And the ways that the reviewers would review the content on the proposal and then provide that rating is they would look at the notes on the side, and for example, with meets expectations for question 1, both the primary criterions were clearly met and substantial evidence and a rationale was provided. And then in regards to the secondary criterion, it was addressed, but it may not have been as clear as the primary criterions. And so if the reviewers provided that particular evidence and looked at these scoring notes and saw that these criterions were substantially met, then they were able to provide a meets expectations rating. For the notes regarding the approaching expectations and the below expectations, the reviewers were guided to think if it was marked as approaching, that meant that both criterions for question 1 were addressed, but the evidence and rationale provided for one of the primary criterions may have been vague or weak, and the secondary criterion might have been somewhat addressed or missing. A below expectations rating was provided if one or both of the primary criterions were missing, and that or the evidence or rationale for both of the primary criterions was vague or weak. Similar with the secondary criterion, also somewhat addressed or missing. So I really encourage all of you to take a look at that literacy rubric scoring notes guide so that you're clear also on the guidance that was provided to reviewers to assign those particular ratings. So as the reviewers were reviewing each proposal, they were required to pull out evidence that would support a rating for every single one of the comprehensive questions. They were then given, provided each question a rating of either meets, approaching, or below. And as all of the reviewers' ratings were submitted, we were able to look across the 3 reviewers' ratings and provide an overall score for each one of the questions on every proposal. And what you can see on your screen is an example for question 1. If reviewer 1 provided a rating of approaching, as did reviewer 2, and then reviewer 3 provided a meets, the overall rating was marked as approaching. I'll pause here and just see if there are any questions thus far before we dive into preparing for revisions. Okay, so preparing for revisions. Last week, every EPP that submitted proposals by April 15th was emailed, their dean and literacy lead was emailed or received an email from our executive director, Amy Wooten, and this is what we call our initial notification letter. And what this letter describes is the particular proposals that either met or did not meet expectations. And we delineated each of these by program level. And on this letter, the most important information to glean from this letter is to understand which proposals require revisions, as well as looking over on the two right-hand columns where it says missing standards and questions requiring revisions, helps the EPP target the particular areas of the proposal that need revision. So each EPP has already received this letter via email. We've also uploaded those into the Dropbox in case others who are engaging in the revision would like that information in front of them. So please review that initial notification letter if you have not done so already. The other really critical resource that's been provided is a 5-page document called the Literacy Proposal Revision Process, Timeline and Guidance. And a lot of what we've already covered today and will continue to talk about is inside of this document. Talks a lot about getting started with the revisions, the logistics for submitting revisions to Dropbox, navigating Dropbox, and the particular resources. So again, a great resource to refer to as you are engaging with the revisions. In terms of locating these resources as well as others that we'll talk about today, each EPP has their Dropbox that was used for the original submission process for the proposal. It's the same folder that you'll be using. You can see a screen grab of an example Pathfinder's University Test folder on here. And what you'll see as you enter into your Dropbox folder is Submission 1 folder, and what that folder contains is we've just consolidated all of the proposal templates and attachments that were submitted for this round 1 into that one folder. So if you're missing any original templates or attachments, they've all been consolidated into that folder. We've also provided review resources for approved programs for those EPPs that may have submitted several proposals, 8 or 9 proposals. There may be the chance that a couple of those proposals have already been approved. And if so, what we have done there is consolidated all of the reviewer feedback into that particular folder. And the third folder on our screen here is the proposal that will be used primarily for your submissions. So what you'll see here is that top folder, Pathfinder's University Proposal 1 Revised. If you enter into that folder, you'll see 2 additional folders, and that's the Review Resources folder, which contains the 2 documents we just talked about, as well as all of the reviewer feedback. And the Proposal 1 Revised folder is where you will actually resubmit your revised proposal folder template and attachments. So if you go into your Review Resources folder, you'll see several documents within there. The first thing that you'll notice is the EPP Literacy Rubric for Early Elementary and Special Education with Scoring Notes. That's the document that we just talked about. And additional documents in there, including what will be named with your EPP abbreviation that will say Proposal 1A, 1B, 1C, and continues for however many proposals require revisions. What those documents are is that they contain the reviewer feedback. And so it will be really important to review each one of those files as they contain the evidence that the reviewers collected as well as the feedback that they have that's particular to the questions that you'll be revising. I want to talk a little bit about how our reviewers were provided guidance to write and provide the feedback that you'll be receiving. So this slide here with reviewer feedback is a slide that we pulled from the reviewer training. And again, the guidance that the reviewers were provided is that they were instructed quality feedback provides that rationale for the rating using specific evidence from the narrative responses and attachments. We thought it was really important that the reviewers were making evidence-based statements and being able to provide those suggestions for improvement and thinking about what was there in that narrative response or what needed to be further explained or developed. We also instructed reviewers to think about how quality feedback addresses how well the narrative responses and evidence consider the proposal questions and rubric criteria, and again, provide those suggestions for improvement. Feedback was required. The guidance we provided is that feedback was required for any responses that were scored as approaching or meets expectations. Approaching or below expectations. I do want to take a moment, though, and just commend our reviewers in terms of what the ask was for this particular process. Reviewers took this process very seriously. They asked very good questions. They wanted to maintain a sense of rigor with their review, but also know that they wanted to be fair. And so the reviewers spent a lot of time really thinking about the evidence and drafting this feedback. It often came in the form of suggestions for improvement as well as prompts or questions for EPPs to consider as they're thinking about revising these narrative responses and attachments. So I just want to commend them. They worked really hard on this. We do understand that this is the nature of this qualitative review is that there are times where the reviewer feedback could have been further developed, or there are areas that may be that you may continue to have questions on, and we're really thinking about this process deeply, and we really encourage you all as you review this reviewer feedback to think about what's really been helpful with this, and if there are continued suggestions for making this feedback process even better, then we encourage you to reach out and talk with us about that. Amy, did you have anything else to add about that?
Sure. So I know many of you probably in some way have been involved with other proposal development or either comprehensive review procedures that your EPP goes through once every 7 years. And this is the first time we have taken a different approach to engaging with reviewers and developing a stronger, what we hope is a stronger feedback process. We very much want, Annie already said this, but we very much want your feedback for us on the value of this for you and what we could do in the future to make it even stronger. We think about this the way that we've thought about teacher evaluation. It's really critical for teachers to get strong feedback from their evaluators when they're being observed so that they can take action to improve their practice. It's also really important that evaluators are well trained to be able to recognize strong instructional practice and give the appropriate types of feedback. And we feel like this model is attempting to begin to reflect that approach. So we encourage you to, share your thoughts with us about this process, and we certainly hope that it is valuable to you. I agree with Annie. I think the reviewers did a tremendous job, and we're very thankful to them.
Okay, we're going to transition and start really talking again about the meat of drafting revisions. And the way that we've structured this next part is to we're going to talk overall, sort of some notes and tips about drafting revisions as you think about the proposal in its entirety. Then we'll spend some time talking a little bit about the individual questions. I can tell you that looking across the proposals as a whole, the areas that needed more revision than others was really particular to question 3. Question 3A, B, C, and D for both early, elementary, and special education programs. I'm going to spend more time talking very deliberately about those particular questions and responses, but I will address questions 1, 2, 4, and 5 as well. So this slide may look familiar. We have overall notes and tips, and this was a slide that was provided if you attended our Literacy Network meeting on March 7th. We provided some guidance to think for EPPs to think through as they were doing some drafting of their proposals. And this entire slide was provided for EPPs to consider. And what I've done here is highlighted some of the bullets in blue because I want to target these. These are some of the areas in looking across reviewer feedback. I feel like if an EPP requires revisions, there are a few tips that we can provide here that may help target that. So as we think about bullet 2 and 3, using language from the rubrics and being explicit when using literacy terminology, what's important to know here is, again, this is a much more substantive review. This is a review that requires not only alignment to the new EPP literacy standards, but also to the state's approach of teaching literacy in Tennessee. And so what's really important here is to not only use the language from the rubrics, but also to think about that literacy terminology as it relates to the teaching literacy in Tennessee approach. And in particular, as we talk about question 3, I will again remind you all that there are hyperlinks to particular read-to-be-ready resources that we've provided within the rubric that will be really helpful to review as you're thinking about when we use this particular term, we are referring to this particular approach. And so again, I would encourage everybody to look at those particular resources as you're engaging in those reviews. It's also very important to not only mention the what, but the why and the how. There were times where proposal responses would mention, but what the reviewer's feedback would say is, I see that there's an attempt to answer this question, but we just need more information, or we need additional description on this particular assessment or opportunity. And so a lot of times it was addressed, but it just needed that step further. In terms of the third bullet, reference helpful information found in other responses and attachments, what we found is that there were times within the narrative responses that EPPs did not explicitly reference the attachment by the naming convention. And what that did is it left the reviewers guessing, is this an attachment, or am I supposed to find additional information here? Or we talked a lot about, at the Literacy Network meeting, really road mapping and not leaving the reviewers out to guess that this is indeed the intention of that response, or this is additional information that could support it. Which really leads me to the next bullet, ensuring that the narrative responses present the primary argument and evidence. What that means is that the weight of the argument, what should really hit on responding to the question, should be located in that narrative response. The attachment should provide additional detail or evidence that will enhance the response that's already provided in that narrative. So it's really important as you're thinking about those revisions that reviewers were given the advice to give the EPP the benefit of the doubt. However, when responses became too vague or there wasn't enough information to consider, that's when a rating may have gone from a meets down to an approaching, for an example. So again, that rationale should be most powerful in the narrative response. And then finally, describing distinctions across programs where applicable. I think this has been a big learning curve for everyone involved. EPPs provided numerous ways of describing their literacy preparation across programs. Some really streamlined several programs onto one proposal, and others chose to create a proposal for one or two programs, which meant they submitted multiple. There's actually really no one right way. In training reviewers, they had a bit of learning curve to understand that for this particular purpose, we're looking for the distinctions that make sense to literacy preparation. There are times where the reviewer feedback might have said, you know, I don't understand how this differs between your early childhood program and your elementary program if they were contained on the, or described on the same proposal. And what that means is that if there are no distinctions across your literacy proposal, sometimes the additional statement of all candidates take the same courses and engage in the same field experiences is what's necessary to make that clarification so that reviewers understand. There are some distinctions that reviewers were looking for. For example, in thinking about early childhood versus, say, like a comprehensive K-12 SPED program, there are times where reviewers are looking for more explicit foundational skills instruction. And when they weren't seeing that as being part of a program, they may have raised the question, you know, where is this happening? Can you describe more of this this particular foundational skills within your response? So again, clarifying, sometimes it's just a matter of making it more explicit for reviewers can really make the difference between what the reviewers are finding and what they're not. So again, reviewers were responsible for reviewing comprehensive questions 1 through 5. However, they were asked to think about the standards and the courses that are taken. So they were asked to review for their own knowledge and for that could potentially provide additional evidence in, for responses, is to look at the standards and the courses that you all provided on the proposal and to think about those in sequence and to see how those might support, for example, question 1 and question 2 responses as well. Again, in that initial notification letter, if there is a column that said yes, that there are missing standards, what that means is that we found evidence that not all of the standards 1 through 5 were aligned or covered on your proposal. And what that means is that if there's a yes under missing standards, then the EPP has the responsibility to go back through and make sure that each one of these standards checkbox is in fact marked within this particular section of the proposal. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to need to go back to a question and revise a narrative response to a question. But again, the purpose of this proposal review is to demonstrate that alignment to the standards, which means all of the standards need to be covered. I'm going to jump into question 2 here, or question 1 and 2, and then we'll pause and take time for questions if we have any. So question 1, again, was thinking about program sequence. And this slide here in front of you breaks down the literacy rubric criteria into the primary criterions that were used and then the secondary criterion. What I've highlighted in blue here, looking across the reviewer feedback, is the particular area of this question that seems to be the area that EPP struggled the most with. And what it means is that concepts related to the standards are introduced, reinforced, assessed, and integrated within practice as the program grows in complexity. And what could be done here to move a response from, say, below or approaching to meets is to use that particular language within responses. So to think about, as you are laying out your entire program sequence, is to talk about candidates do this, and there's a reason why they're doing it first here in this particular course, and then as they move to subsequent courses after that, they're building on those skills in these particular ways. They're reinforcing these particular strategies. Then they have the opportunity to practice these within their multiple field experiences in these particular ways. So really using that language can move a response from, say, a below or an approaching up to that meet. So I really focus in on that particular language as it is a primary criterion. In regards to question 2, we had EPPs tended to do pretty well on this particular question. The blue language I've highlighted here, and looking across, when I've highlighted gradual release of responsibility, again, when reviewers were providing feedback, if we didn't see, similar to question 1, if they weren't able to see how the clinical experiences built on one another and that they gradually gave more opportunity for candidates to develop their practice over time, then there were additional questions being raised for reviewers to provide that evidence. The other thing to pay attention to as well, if you look at the scoring notes guide for this question, in order to meet expectation, there has to be clear evidence that at least 3 of these gradual release of responsibility benchmarks are met. And at times they weren't met because the full benchmark wasn't met. So for example, there may have been evidence that candidates are observing classroom instruction, but that and is also important as well, to also engage within those team collaboration meetings, really supports the entirety of that benchmark of that clinical experience. So paying attention to the entirety of those bullets and those benchmarks will be really helpful if there are areas that you need to revise for question 2. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and just see if there are any particular questions about either the standards, program sequence, or clinical experiences. Okay, everyone, we did receive a question, and it was the question was, will we have more space to elaborate on our questions should they require revisions? And so what the instructions are is that we do need to adhere to the original word count limit. So if there is a question that requires revisions, you are free to revise that entire response. And so if the limit is 1,000 words, for example, you are still held to that particular word count. But there are 2 things that I want to say about that. The first thing is what I would do if a reviewer is providing feedback that says, you know, we really need more detail about this, or, you know, additional information is needed about this. The first thing I would do is look at the primary criterion and think about, is this prioritized in my narrative response? And if it's not, then think about what might be eliminated from that narrative response that can really, so that my narrative response is really targeting that primary criterion. The second bit of advice I would give on that is to also take advantage of the attachments that are available for each question. Remember that only question 3 requires evidence as an attachment, but questions 1, 2, 4, and 5, EPPs are still given that opportunity to provide additional attachments to support those answers if they so choose. And so again, prioritizing what you say to address those primary criterions within the narrative responses would be what I would recommend to do first, and then to take advantage of the attachments to provide additional evidence would be my second suggestion. So I'm going to move on and talk a bit about questions 3A, B, C, and D. This was the slide that was provided at the Literacy Network meeting to think about this question as a whole, and I wanted to reiterate a few things in particular on this slide. The first thing would be is to just remind EPPs that an alternate rubric is used to evaluate the special education programs. So I think one of the main areas that we noticed looking across the reviewer feedback is that when an EPP was addressing a special education program, it wasn't always clear that they were addressing the particular special education criteria listed on that rubric. So again, make sure that you're using and referencing that particular criteria if you're addressing a special education program. If you're streamlining multiple early, elementary, and special education programs within a single proposal, then you should be looking across the criteria in both sets for question 3A, B, C, and D for both early elementary and special education. So that should be something to consider as you're thinking about those revisions for question 3. In addition, this is really the area where reviewers are looking for the how. So it's not quite enough to say that candidates are doing this, this, and this, but to really elaborate on how they're doing it. And sometimes the best advice that was given is to state this is what the expectations of the candidates are for this assignment and how it aligns to that criteria rubric or the rubric criteria, and then to follow it up with a for example. And sometimes providing that additional sentence or pointing them exactly into finding where on that attachment they can find that particular evidence is enough to convince the reviewers that there is a substantial amount of detail to respond to that question. So we'll take a look at question 3A. Looking across reviewer feedback again, I've highlighted in blue here the primary criterion that's listed: articulate how skills-based and knowledge-based competencies work together to make meaning from text. This seems to be a struggle for EPPs, again, looking at the reviews. One bit of advice I think that was really helpful, I actually took from a proposal from a reviewer. And this was particularly helpful because I think it responds to a lot of inquiries that folks might have had regarding question 3A. And the example feedback that was provided was that the language of the rubric is used in response but lacks clear communication as to how knowledge of the competencies will occur for the candidate and how the candidate will facilitate the learning of competencies for the student. We've tried on more than one occasion to really emphasize the idea that candidates need to demonstrate how skills-based and knowledge-based competencies work together, and that candidate assessment that's provided needs to show evidence of that so that the candidate will be able to make those connections for the students in that regard. So again, in thinking through question 3A, I would really target that primary criterion that addresses how candidates will be articulating skills-based and knowledge-based competencies. In regards to 3B, there were not any look-in cross-reviewer feedback. There were not any particular criterions that were standing out as needing substantial support. Again, paying attention to the hyperlinks to the Read to Be Ready resources here will be really helpful. And again, looking at every word within this criteria will be helpful. So, for example, thinking about purposefully sequenced text sets and thinking about what does that look like in terms of candidate preparation and what the expectations are for the candidates within their assessments. So it may also be helpful in thinking about these primary criterions is to turn them around and ask them as questions yourself. How are we having candidates analyze multiple texts for quantitative, qualitative, reader, and task factors? And I also think that the inclusion of scoring mechanisms here might also be able to be helpful in terms of providing additional evidence. In regards to question 3C for early and elementary, and actually looking ahead to the special education question 3C, the area that needed the most support was providing implicit, embedded, and explicit vocabulary instruction. I think there may still be some confusion about what those terms mean. What I did here is I pulled out a particular response from a meets expectation proposal that provided a real explicit example, I think, of what was required of candidates within their assessment in regards to this vocabulary instruction. And this proposal read, as part of the assignment, candidates use the identified Tier 2 words to provide explicit teaching in the form of visuals or mnemonic strategies so that students spend time acquiring general academic terms. Candidates also focus on implicit vocabulary instruction of Vocabulary 3. During interactive read-alouds, candidates identify 2 to 3 words in which they spend just a moment explaining within context of the story or text. Candidates are required to identify these domain-specific words ahead of time and justify the supports they will use to support student understanding of the words during that read-aloud. So again, what that does is it calls out the difference when we're preparing candidates for implicit vocabulary instruction versus explicit. Here are the particular things that we engage our candidates in. So an example, again, of making that more clear for the reviewers. For question 3D, the terms synthesize and incrementally are bolded or highlighted in blue, and what reviewers had said is to really think about what evidence is there for students to incrementally show. There was not enough evidence in the reviewers' eyes to see how these knowledge and skills are built comprehensively through these daily tasks to then culminate into this end-of-unit task. So again, supporting that language to show that incremental build or that synthesis is really the best way to move from that maybe below or approaching to the meat. For our special education 3A through D, what I've done here is highlighted the language that differs from the early elementary rubric to the special education rubric in red. These are also the particular areas that EPPs tended to struggle with. And again, it may be just calling attention to using that special education rubric criteria as you're navigating your revisions. One particular area on question 3A for special education was showing how candidates will demonstrate proficiency in the various modes of communication, expressive and receptive. One particular response that was provided to that was a meets expectation ranking included that really went into detail about what it means for candidates to demonstrate this proficiency. And they were including opportunities for candidates to model think-alouds, to demonstrate the pedagogical thinking on lesson plans, to communicate planning within peers, and to prompt students to self-reflect by asking if the answers, are the answers in the book or are they in my head? And so again, this is a very metacognitive process of understanding that teachers communicate in various ways for multiple purposes, which is really foundational to understanding that students are going to learn and understand and communicate in various ways as well. So really targeting that particular primary criterion will be helpful in revisions for question 3A with special education. Question 3B for special ed, one particular area that was shown as needing additional support were the two red primary criterions listed. Consider the various ways students access text materials and to demonstrate the multiple ways to design instruction for students. And again, looking across responses that meet expectations here, for special education, one particular response is articulating how they engage candidates in thinking about aided and unaided systems regarding communication. So again, unaided systems, the sign language, the body language, the gestures and the facial expressions, and the aided systems, the speech generating devices, the text tracking devices, pointers, et cetera. How are they engaging candidates in ways that students are accessing text as opposed to just putting the book in front of them or having them talk about those text and materials back. So we're looking for additional detail that's going to support our special education students and their varied needs. Question 3C for special education, again, is really targeting that providing explicit, embedded, and implicit vocabulary instruction. I think the explanation we provided for the early and elementary 3C may be really helpful here, again, in thinking about what do those terms mean and how are we providing those opportunities for candidates. And then question 3D, again, there's no difference in terms of the primary criterion for the special education rubric, but there is the addition of the collaboration with general education teachers to ensure that tasks are aligned with students' IEP and IFSP goals. Again, if we're looking really carefully about that special education rubric criteria, just ensure that all of these are addressed, and that may be the difference between moving from below and approaching to meet. So I'll pause here for just a second and see if there are any questions related to 3A, B, C, D for early elementary or special education. Okay, we're going to move on to questions 4 and 5. Question 4 addressed student difference. What I've highlighted here in blue is the particular area in the primary criterion of positioning students as knowledgeable and valuable contributors of information. Typically, responses did not have any issues in describing the differentiated literacy instruction to meet students' needs. It was the area of positioning students as knowledgeable and valuable contributors of information. That was a targeted area to think more carefully through in order to provide that additional evidence. And then question 5 for professional learning, there's 2 areas in blue that I've highlighted. There are several professional learning opportunities that were provided from EPPs that would really hit on meets expectation, but weren't always clear that they were specific to literacy. And so really ensuring that these opportunities for professional learning is targeted for literacy is really what we're looking for in regards to question 5. Also highlighted in blue is the communication of literacy assessment information to various audiences. Oftentimes, again, there was the EPP would articulate, we're providing these opportunities for candidates to talk about this literacy assessment, but the reviewers just needed additional information about what does this look like and how are they doing that. So the addition of 1 or 2 sentences to provide that clarification there will be helpful. Okay, so we've targeted particular areas of questions and provided some additional support in terms of the questions and responses that have been at meets expectations. And what we want to do here is transition into talking about logistics in relation to submitting the revisions. So we wanted to provide a little bit of guidance, and this guidance is also provided in that 5-page document for guidance and timeline in case you need additional additional detail about the submission process. We ask that you complete each proposal revision on the department's PDF template that you've already used for your original submission. And what we've bolded here, and I'm going to have Amy chime in just a second, that you may only revise the questions as noted in the letter that you received from the department. And there's reasons for that as well. Amy, would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. Due in part to capacity of our review process and the timeline in terms of getting this feedback back to you in order to prepare for the third revision or the second revision opportunity later this summer, we will not ask reviewers to consider questions or evidence that has already been deemed as meeting expectations. And so what that means is that that is approved as it was written. And so we are not approving any changes to those questions, and they should remain the same. So again, we invite you to revise the questions that are not yet meeting expectations, and you should leave the other questions as they are. We just got a question that says, does this mean we resubmit the entire document or just the revised questions with areas not needed to be revised blank?
I think it's fine to leave. The reviewers will be instructed, they will be handed your initial notification letter, which articulates the particular questions that they are required to review again. And so I think it's fine to just leave the proposal as is, because they will only be looking at the particular questions that we've identified for them as needing revisions.
So I want to follow up on that question. So what you should be doing is using the template that you completed and submitted for round 1, and then just edit the questions or revise the questions that where you weren't already meeting expectations. So you wouldn't have any blanks because what should be there is what was already approved. So just take that old proposal and just revise the sections that need attention.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. We also want to ensure that you're adhering to the narrative word count limits as described on the proposal templates, and that you're following the attachment limitations and naming conventions very carefully. Reviewers really rely on that. Again, the naming conventions, they're looking specific for that particular evidence. And so when you name it appropriately, they know exactly where to look within that folder. There have been times where attachments have been submitted that are longer than what we have set as our expectation. Reviewers will be advised to only review up to the page limit of the attachment, so please do not go beyond that attachment limit, as it will not be reviewed. We've also learned a lot from this process in terms of document format. We really encourage everybody to save all files as PDFs, and we want to, what that does is eliminate problems in terms of formatting and conversions depending on what's being used to read and review. So please save all of your files as PDF. Again, your proposals will be submitted using Dropbox. earlier in the webinar, I showed you exactly where to upload those documents, and that's reiterated again in screenshots on your guidance and timeline document as well. We've already pre-labeled the proposal folders so that you can go into your Dropbox and see exactly what we're expecting on your end in terms of revisions, and that should match the initial notification letter that was sent out as well. If there are any areas of confusion there or misalignment, please email me and let me know, and we will be sure to communicate with you and clarify those questions. Just a reminder about your naming conventions. You should be submitting for question 3 attachments, the naming conventions as Q3 underscore, and then evidence 1, 2, 3, et cetera, up to 10 attachments for question 3. Any optional evidence submitted for questions 1, 2, 4, and 5 should follow that same naming convention. We did receive a question that says, if only special education did not meet expectations, do we still submit all other documents? I think that's referring to question 3, special education. I guess I need a little bit more clarification on that question. If only special education did not meet expectations, do we submit all other documents?
Does it mean attachments?
If you mean attachments, only question 3. Okay. So the only thing that needs to be submitted is anything that's related to the questions that require revisions. So if question 3A, B, C for special education require revisions, then you will revise those narrative responses and then upload the attachments that support those narrative responses in relation to special education. If questions 3A, B, and C for your early and elementary program met expectations, you do not need to resubmit anything in that regard. Okay, just a few other reminders regarding submission. Be sure to redact all identifiable information. Again, this is a blind review, and there are areas that require your attention that you may not think of in terms of identifiable information, but even email addresses can provide that EPP name, phone numbers, names of faculty, of course the institution. We want to make sure that all of that identifiable information is redacted before it is submitted. And please make sure that you're opening, editing, and saving files in an Adobe PDF viewer. This is free from the internet. This is going to alleviate any potential formatting problems. Similarly, as you are looking at reviewer feedback, it is best for you to download those files onto your desktop and then open them as opposed to viewing them within Dropbox. That can sometimes alleviate some of the problems. So please be sure that we're doing all things in PDF. Makes everybody's life easier. In terms of next steps, you can submit your revisions to the Dropbox folders on or before June 30th. Revisions will be reviewed as they are submitted. If you do submit your revisions before June 30th, please send me a quick email and just let me know that those have been uploaded and are ready for review before June 30th. Again, if you wait till June 30th, then we will review all of those upon that deadline as well. We do thank you for attending our webinar today in terms of thinking through those revisions and the process. I am here and available to answer any additional questions that you might have as you are thinking through this process. Amy just reminded me we're going to talk briefly through this timeline that was submitted in the documentation you've already received. Just to continue our conversation about the timeline, by June 30th, all these revisions are required to the department via Dropbox. And the reviewers will engage in the reviews as soon as they are turned in through July 20th. On or before July 20th, EPPs will receive notification of approval or need for revisions for round 2. If revisions are then required again after this round, any of those revisions will be required to be submitted to the department by August 3rd. We will then finish our review process by August 31st and be able to notify EPPs of their final notification of approval or denial.
I do want to note that these deadlines are firm in order to ensure a fair process. We've talked with our general counsel about engaging in this process, and so if we receive proposals that are submitted beyond the deadline, they will not be eligible to be reviewed for the second round and would have to be reviewed as a part of the third round. So please just make sure that you're paying attention to that June 30th date and that you have all items submitted on or before that date.
We did have one question. Will the same reviewers review the submission? That's the plan. I can't promise that exactly, but we have set it up so that the same reviewers will be able to reread the revised proposal templates and attachments. I don't want to promise that necessarily because we want to ensure that we are making sure that things are timely and done in ways that will ensure that you get back the feedback that you need. So, but that is our plan. At this time, we'll take any other final questions that you have. We'll stay on the line for the next couple minutes. And for those of you that are taking off this weekend, having a nice holiday, stay safe. Please let me know if you have any individual questions regarding those revisions, and we will be able to navigate those as they come in. Question, will these slides be available? Yes, we are recording this webinar, and we will make our edits on this and get this webinar recording and the PowerPoint to you next week. So we will stay on the line for just a couple minutes. Thank you so much for those who attended, and we will stay on the line. So we have a question about, do all reviewers have to rate questions as meet expectations? What we did is at the beginning part of the webinar, we talked about how we looked across all 3 of the ratings from reviewers, and we took the 2/3 response to create an overall rating. So for example, if the question was marked approaching, meets across the 3 reviewers, then we gave it an overall score of approaching. This is actually this is on slide 10. So you should not actually see individual ratings for the question reviewers. What we did is once these reviews were all turned into the department, we looked across and did that.
We provided the overall.
We provided the overall. So what you should have in the feedback from the reviewers is the evidence that they collected and then the feedback in relation to those particular questions, not individual ratings. So just to be clear, the overall ratings for each question is what is indicated on that initial notification letter that came from Amy. So the column over on the right-hand side where it says questions needing revisions, any question that's listed over there on that right-hand column are the ones that either were below or approaching and require revisions. If there's not a question listed there, then that means it did receive a meets expectations rating.
I can't hear anything.
So we got a question about how much help could someone get from the literacy specialist who designed the elementary side of your program. I think that's up to your own EPP. We, strongly encourage a lot of collaboration across this, but that's an EPP decision about how much various faculty will work collaboratively. We also got a note that it would have been helpful to know if the response was approaching or below. I think that part of the reason that we did not provide that information was because we didn't want to sway or overly concern folks if something was rated below. At this point, it's just not meeting expectations, and we really want you to be focused on the feedback that you got rather than whether it was approaching or below. If you have a particular concern about a question, I think Annie definitely would be a great resource to reach out and talk with her about how you might interpret that feedback. Yes, we did provide the feedback from all 3 reviewers.
And again, those are located within your Dropbox form or Dropbox folder. And what you'll see if it's proposal 1, for example, that's requiring those revisions, you'll see your EPP name and then proposal 1 and then 1A, 1B, 1C. And those are all all 3 of the reviewers that reviewed the your proposal.
Well, we thank you all for attending this webinar and wish you the best of luck in your revision process, and certainly hope that you do have some time to enjoy a long weekend before maybe diving back into that. And as always, we are available to communicate with you as needed, so please don't hesitate to reach out, and have a great Thursday.
Thank you.